That's war. No longer be beloved celebrities. You will be wrathful gods. When the time comes, will you answer the call?
Well, how do you follow up from last week's episode, which many, including myself, would consider to be the best episode of the season so far? Well, you take a trip down to the farm where some animals have to be put down. Which, speaking of putting down, we see Hughie has to make a tough decision as we get to experience the future of the VCU at V52. As it is time for us to discuss and break down episode 5 of season 4 of The Boys, spoilers ahead. We open with taking a look back at all the Supes who paved the way for the current Supes as V52 Expo is here. As Homelander watches the opening of this event from the sidelines, we see he's still thinking about his recent return back home. As Sage asks Homelander how his visit was and gets no response, and for the first time we don't get our regular back and forth banter between the two, as she can just tell that something's off with him. As we watch her try to make small talk with Homelander, but again we can just tell that his mind's elsewhere. Now I gotta admit, I got a kick out of the shots being taken at studios, but mainly Disney and Marvel Studios in my eyes in this episode, as Deep and his co-host Cameron present the phases 7 through 19 of the VCU timeline. Now, taking a look at these hilarious titles, let me know in the comments which of these projects were your favorite ones, or which one would you most be excited to see. For me, I'm gonna have to go with G-Man, Days Past from the Future. That title is just hilarious. Now, taking a look at this week's side plots, we have Hughie Sr., who's fully awake and claims he's never felt better after being labeled almost brain dead, as he considers it to be a miracle. As Hughie pulls his mom aside to confront her about giving his dad the V, which she gave his dad after it fell out of his pocket in last week's episode. She thought that Hughie was intending to give the V to his father, but did it on herself, as she is now confused by why she's being questioned by Hughie of what she did. She tells Hughie that she did it because he already grew up without one parent in his life and didn't want him to lose another one. We get to see Hughie enjoying some time with both of his parents for the first time since he was 6 years old, as they talk about their honeymoon and sharing some laughs and some old memories, and they also go as far as talking about traveling together again as a family. Now, Hughie does ask his father why he gave the power of attorney to his mom, as he tells Hughie that he ultimately did that because he doesn't feel as though Hughie has the stomach to make tough decisions in life. A very important line to remember later in this episode, as we start to see the side effects from giving him the V is starting to take place as he starts to forget things. Now, shortly after, Hughie Sr. goes missing, but they find him next to a dead body with that person's heart in his hand. As Hughie Sr. doesn't remember adult Hughie, as he panics and phases through the wall and runs into a patient and unphases in him, leaving a bloody mess. Now, they find Hughie Sr. in the middle of the hallway and they try to get him under control, but it doesn't work. Again, he doesn't recognize adult Hughie, and when he sees Daphne, he gets upset because she left them and says,
"And you looked through me like I wasn't even there."
I thought his choice of words were very interesting because I always wondered how certain Supes' powers came to be, and it seems that when people take V later in life, their powers are based on their current personality or past experiences that affected them or hurt them. As Hughie Sr. said to Daphne that he felt unseen and saying to her that she looked through him, and now his Supes' power allowed him to phase through things like they're not even there. As we see Hughie telling his dad that he's his hero to stop him from killing his mom, and he does snap back to himself, and it actually works. As we see, Hughie does have to make that tough decision at the end of this episode, which will tie back to the Campbell family here in a bit. Meanwhile, we see in this week's episode that Starlight is completely broken. On TV, Annie watches Firecracker talking about how she's going to press charges against Annie from last week's beatdown. Now, after Annie's meltdown, we see that her foundation is completely emptied and it has been destroyed, with people leaving some very upsetting words on the wall for her to see. Now, throughout this episode, it's never really explained to why Annie's struggling to use her powers. To me, it was most likely because she's been confused on who she actually is, and with everything going on, she just doesn't know how to control herself. Now, I would say that her confidence is severely damaged and causing her not to be able to tap into her abilities to use her powers. And like I mentioned in my review last week, I feel as though that we're going to probably see her struggle for another couple of episodes, and it'll probably take someone like Queen Maeve to return to help her get her confidence back. Now, sticking with another character whose confidence is gone, let's talk about Frenchie, who really isn't doing that much in this entire episode. Now, earlier in the episode, he finds a necklace in his desk that takes him back to a time when he was a religious person. Now, he's mostly high in the episode and has a brief conversation with Annie about belief in God, and later we see him turn himself in. Again, I've said it before, but the show has no idea what to do with Frenchie at this point. Now, we'll be discussing his decision a little bit later in the breakdown and what it could mean moving forward. Now, in this episode, we see Emma MM is still dealing with his family drama as we follow up with his daughter, who's now been suspended from school after continuing to act up and get into a fight with a Homelander supporter. Now, MM's daughter claimed that she took action in fighting because of what her dad does for a living, as he is tasked to fixing the situation, which is his main motivation to surviving the farm massacre later in this episode, to get back home to his daughter to help her and to get her on the right path. Now, we see Butcher meeting with Joe earlier in the episode, as Joe wants Butcher to ditch the boys as he breaks down each member and how they're not fit to get the job done. Now, I've seen the speculation online and I've seen it in my comments section regarding Joe being like a version of Becca for Butcher and not actually being there. And after this conversation and what happens a little bit later in this episode, I think is 100% true. For example, just looking at this exact scene, how else would Joe know those details about the members of the boys? Hell, even Joe sounded like Butcher when he was talking about the different members of the boys and also talking about how his tumor was getting worse. To me, just add more fuel to the idea that Becca is Butcher's good conscience, or in the metaphor of like a good angel, bad angel on his shoulder, Becca being the good side of him while Joe is being the bad side of him and representing the devil. Now, Butcher does rejoin the boys and he tells them that he doesn't have answers for how he mysteriously killed Ezekiel in last week's episode, but he does tell them that he does have the answers to all their prayers and shares with them that he has a virus that can kill the Supes. Now, like Butcher said to Victoria back in episode 1, he knows that the virus isn't strong enough to kill Homelander quite yet, which I don't know how he knows if it will work or not towards Homelander, but as I digress, he does plan to take it from Vic and wants to try it on her to kill her. But first, they need to get a familiar face out of prison. But switching gears and talking about what's going on at V52, we have A-Train and Sage talking about the leak, and it appears that she's very aware of his involvement, but right now she's playing very coy. Now let's have this conversation in the comments below, because like I said, I feel like Sage is 100% sure that she knows that A-Train is the leak, but she's not sharing it with Homelander and the other members. Now, do you think that she's keeping this information for her grander plan? Does she keep this information because of their past as teens together? Does she have a soft spot for A-Train? Let me know why you all think that she's not selling him out quite yet in this season. Now, the funniest and maybe the best part of this episode to me was cutting and seeing the various trailers of what's to come in the VCU, including a movie for Firecracker and A-Train. As we continue to see the show taking shots at companies like Disney, like I mentioned earlier, we see A-Train is on stage and talking to the audience about the most expensive TV show ever with the reshoots for the reshoots, as he says,
most expensive TV show ever. So, you know, it's gotta be good, am I right?
But maybe the best part and maybe the funniest moment of this episode for me is, and this being a perfect example of the boys poking fun of forced diversity within corporations, is them talking about the new diversity program headed by A-Train, Sage, and Black Noir. The idea behind the white audience seeing a tailor-made product placement versus the black audience was just so damn funny to me. Now, we see Firecracker isn't as dumb as she appears, at least in the eyes of Sage, as she confronts her about her plan last week of getting Starlight to beat her up, as she tells Sage,
Just think I'm stupid, poor white trash.
I don't think you're poor.
Underestimate me all you want. Makes that much easier to stick the fucking shiv in your back.
Now the question is, will this be a continued beef between these two characters? And what exactly does Firecracker have planned for Sage? Honestly, whatever they have planned for Firecracker and Sage, I hope it doesn't dumb down Sage, because again, if you are telling me that she's the smartest person in the world and her to be outsmarted by Firecracker would just completely diminish that idea. Now in the episode, we see that A-Train goes to Ashley because he needs her help to get Sage off his back, as he tells her that he was the actual leak. Now initially, Ashley doesn't want to have anything to do with helping him, but we see A-Train tells her, if you take me down, he's going to take her with her, as we see her plan come into motion by the end of this episode. Honestly, I can see Ashley playing along for now, because as we saw in this episode, Cameron ended up breaking up with her, so I think it kind of helped her out at this moment, but ultimately, I think Ashley's going to end up selling out A-Train. Now back on stage, the Guardians of Godolphin, Sam, and Kate are introduced to the audience. If you watch Gen V like I did, you'll remember in the finale that Kate lost her arm, but it seems like she has a new arm in this moment, and it also seems as though that Sam is still under his careless state of mind how he was left at the end of the finale of Gen V. Now I'm a fan of Kate and Sam and how they were used in season 1 of Gen V, but as it pertains to their inclusion and their cameo in this episode, I'll be honest, I was a bit disappointed because they didn't really feel like they needed to be there at all. but I get that this is them setting up season 2 of Gen V. Now we see Ryan making his return in this week's episode as we watch Adam pitches Ryan and Homelander his television series, but the newfound Homelander actually asks Ryan his opinion as he tells him that he doesn't want to do it. Now we watch Homelander force Adam to give Ryan his wallet and keys as Homelander and Ryan have a bit of a heart-to-heart with one another as they're walking in the hallways, as he tells him that he doesn't have to follow the rules anymore, and he also says,
We are both emancipated from slavery.
Now, honestly, I'm not buying this newfound appreciation that Homelander has for Ryan and listening to his opinions. I think he's just kind of playing the long game and right now just playing to be a good dad and listening to Ryan, but ultimately he's going to force him to do what he wants him to do. Now, backstage at V52, we see Ryan tells his dad that he wants to help people, he wants to actually be a hero and not doing all the fake stage saves as we saw a couple episodes ago. Now, Homelander hears him out and he actually sets him up on his first real hero moment in his eyes as Homelander calls over Adam and the young assistant that he's been bothering this entire episode. We see Ryan makes Adam apologize to her, but he doesn't like his tone and makes him do it again on his knees. Yet again, Ryan isn't pleased with this apology as he makes the assistant slap Adam over and over again, as we see that Ryan clearly is enjoying this. As far as enjoying this myself, I'll be honest, this whole he's a good kid, he's a bad kid isn't really working for me so far in this season. I like how the Ryan and Butcher relationship has been playing out so far, but I can't say the same about how it's been handled between Ryan and Homelander. Now I get it, Ryan's a kid, he was sheltered for most of his life, he is easily influenced, and he's at that age where they're very, very, very impressionable. But the last time we saw him, I'm just speaking to the narrative of the story, he was upset about killing the stuntman and seamlessly got into a fight, his first fight with his dad who was yelling at him for being with Butcher, and now all is forgiven and he's now leaning into the somewhat evil side of being Homelander's son? To me, Ryan is more of a MacGuffin this season than an actual character with actual motives and development. Let me know how you all felt about Ryan and how he was using this episode. Do you feel like me that it's kind of underwritten, or do you enjoy it? Let's talk about it in the comments below. Now back with the boys, we see Butcher and MM pay Stan Edgar a visit in prison, as they tell him they want his help to get the V from Vic, and in return, he'll get his freedom from prison. Initially, Stan doesn't want to help the boys, but we see Butcher tells him what Vic did to her daughter and giving her the V, and if he'll help, he'll not only get his freedom, but they'll actually give him custody of her as well. We see that Stan eventually does agree to help the boys and he joins the crew. Now, I'll be honest, this is a sight that I didn't think we'll ever see, and that is Stan working with the boys together. As they arrive to one of Stan's properties where Vic will go to keep her plans and secrets, they enter and they notice that there's blood stains on the wall, and it leads down to the basement where they find a testing laboratory for the virus being used on animals. As Butcher finds a rabbit who was getting shot up by Temp V, which reappears later in this episode, as the rest of the crew notices that the testing has seamlessly ended and something bad must have happened. And all of a sudden, all their noses start to bleed as we see that Vic is here and she got the alert from Stan's ankle monitor. Quick family reunion about betrayal is cut short when Vic questions what they've done with her lead scientist, Samir. Now Stan has to convince her to not kill the boys, but instead let the boys help her in finding her missing scientist. Now on this mission to find this missing scientist, they find some dead body with eggs in their stomach as they come across a beat-up chicken that flies through one of Vic's guard's stomachs, killing him. As they make their way out of the barn, we see that Vic and Butcher get into a disagreement as she spills the beans about him making a deal with her earlier in this season. Now as they continue to look for Samir, we see that Butcher comes across that bunny that he let free out of that cage who's ultimately dying, and as it's getting its final breath, we see these tentacles popping out of its stomach. Now I think it's safe to assume that those tentacles can be found in Butcher and was probably what killed Ezekiel in last week's episode, and one would say that mixing the V and the Temp V does this to an individual. Meanwhile, the crew almost gets attacked by a V'd up bull who ends up getting eaten by some sheep that are flying. As they eventually find Samir, who we also learn is actually Zoe's dad, now he tells them that the virus is mostly gone except for one dose. As MM has to give the crew a pep talk and a reality check and convinces them to work together instead of for picking someone as bait, as they ultimately decide to inject the dead body with the last dose in hopes that the animals will eat them and get infected. As their plan ultimately works and we see the sheep are dying and fall out of the sky, meanwhile Samir is missing and thought to be dead as Butcher just pops out of nowhere. As we see, Stan ends up getting taken back to prison because he didn't get the deal done as MM says, but he's later broken out by Vic as it is assumed that they're now on the same page, or they'll probably most likely be using one another to get what they want. Now we end this episode with Sage showing Tech Knight something that shocks him, and she tells him to keep it under wraps. Now that's never really explained what she showed him, but I think it's safe to assume that it has something to do with A-Train. Meanwhile, Homelander gives the team a speech about what it takes to being a hero. As he says it's time for war, but first it's time to plug the leak as Deep brings in Cameron. Now this was of course being the favor that A-Train asked for from Ashley earlier in the episode, as like I mentioned, she was getting her revenge on being broken up with earlier in this episode as well. As they listen to Homelander's orders to show some wrath as they kill Cameron. Now, unfortunately, Kimiko had nothing to do in this episode except for talking about Frenchie, as we see her messaging him about being there for one another, but while she's doing that, we see that he's at the police station turning himself in, admitting to murder. Now, as harsh as this may sound, but I thought this was the best thing for Frenchie, which is I hope that he's in jail for the next several episodes because his plot has been the worst of this entire season. Now, back with the Campbell family, we do see that Hughie does cook up a drug to put his dad down as Daphne and Hughie say their goodbyes, and Hughie does actually followed through with making a tough decision, which is letting his dad go. Now, admittedly, losing his father didn't hit me as emotionally as I know the show intended to be, but I will say I thought that the performance by Simon Pegg was phenomenal. Like, he was the best character in this episode, seeing the emotional depths of him as an actor, playing to being the cheesy, corny dad that we know him to be in the show, but then going to those darker levels, and then the emotional goodbye to his son. Again, I wish I was more connected to their personal story, but again, I'm going to give kudos to Simon Pegg, who was phenomenal in this episode. Now, this might be a bit of a stretch, but I did feel like there was a parallel going on between what the boys were doing with having to put down those V'd up animals, and then kind of looking at how that parallels to Hughie having to put down his own dad. Now, the last scene of the episode shows Butcher taking Joe back to the farm, where we find out that Butcher actually made it look as though Samir was dead, only for him to cut off his leg, and he wants him to make them more of the virus. Now, to tie it back to the whole, is Joe there? Is he made up? Now, I think Joe actually was an actual person, but if you go back to when Joe and Butcher were talking in episode 1, and he talked about how Joe was saved by Butcher 11 years ago, I don't think he saved Joe. I think Joe actually died, but Butcher kind of kept that version of Joe attached to him and never really let him go, very similar to what happened with Becca. But like the scene at them in the park being somewhat an evidence of him not being there, I think this particular scene right here really submits that he isn't really there. Now, the biggest reason I say that Joe isn't here is this scene in particular, this moment when Samir looks over when Butcher says we and they, and he's talking to Joe, but when Samir looks over, the face that he gives almost gives the illusion that Butcher was talking to himself and wasn't actually talking to Joe. So again, I'm pretty confident that Joe is going to be revealed to be another Becca and be the evil side of Butcher. I could be wrong, but I think this episode really proves that Joe really isn't there. Now, while there were some good laughs to be had at the V52 Expo, and I always love seeing Giancarlo Esposito as he returns as Stan, that was very intriguing, but overall, I thought this episode was not only underwhelming, but it was extremely lackluster. To me, the writing seemed to be off, but more importantly, the characters didn't feel like themselves. Now, I have no evidence to prove this, but if you all know how shows and movies are made, they never shoot things in order, and I felt like this episode was like their first day on set. Again, none of the characters seemed to be like themselves, but also the chemistry just seemed really off. Like, to me, the stuff at the farm seemed uneven. Even going back to Kate and Sam, who, like I said, I like as characters in their show Gen V, but it seemed like their characters were like in a completely different mindset. Like, I almost feel like they shot this scene from The Boys before they even shot their finale of Gen V. Now, I hope I can look back on this episode as just being simplified to a setup for the back half of the season, as this episode showed how Ryan is now being more sinister, and we have Homelander making out his plans. We have A-Train being called out for being the leak by Sage potentially. Tech Knight just randomly popping up. I assume that he's going to be set up in a future episode or having something to do with this main plot. Of course, we have Frenchie in jail, jail, which I can see Kimiko probably breaking him out, and eventually we're gonna probably see Annie getting her confidence back. And of course, this episode showing the bunny with the tentacles, I'm pretty sure that we're gonna learn what Butcher's new powers are, and again, the big reveal of if Joe is made up or if he's real. Again, I hope that this particular setup episode does have a payoff, because I do consider this to be the worst episode of this season so far. That's gonna be the end of this week's breakdown. Let me know what you all thought of the episode in the comments below. Share any deeper meanings or important things that you all took away from this episode, but of course, share your thoughts, your theories, and your predictions of what you all hope to see in the weeks ahead. Thanks again for watching this week's breakdown. Make sure to check out my playlist of all of my boys' coverage. You all are awesome. Stay safe, and I'll catch you all on the next video.